Okay, so I would like to have a look at how best to approach the role-play task that you will often find in speaking assessments. And I think this is quite important to have a look at because this is one of the tasks that students generally tend to find most daunting. Because there's obviously a couple of parts there that you can't really prepare that way for, but I try to give you some tips and see if we can find a way to prepare for this kind of task when it comes to your GCSEs. So as before, I will put the link to this presentation down below in the comment section so that you can follow along and do some of the tasks on there, and it should also help you to recap anything that you want, or I will also show you how you can take notes within that presentation. So obviously speaking assessments are really quite daunting, and I think in particular the role-play task can be quite challenging, as I said, just because there's a lot of things that you can't really prepare for that well. There's one unforeseen question, for example, that you need to respond to, and that can make it quite tricky. But the good thing is, once you've done a couple of those, it should get a bit easier because they're all quite similar in a way, and there's a lot of recurring tasks where you're supposed to provide an opinion, for example, for something, and then you can use the same structure again and again and again. So what we have a look at is obviously some general information and advice from the examiners, some helpful vocabulary, some examples, and then I give you some practice tasks and more tips and tricks that you might find helpful when preparing for the role-play. So in general, there will be 5 tasks in the role-play, and they're marked based on the clarity of your communication. So you should try to avoid making any kind of grammar mistakes or using any unclear vocabulary, because it's really just how clear and correct your communication is. So you don't need to include anything fancy, but just make sure that your communication is clear. There will be 2 special tasks that I show you in a second. So one is an unforeseen question where you just need to answer spontaneously, and then one is a part where you are required to ask a question yourself based on the key information they give you in the task. And then it's also important to have a look at the prompt to determine the situation that you are supposed to reenact, I guess. And it's also important to check how you need to address the examiner, because you can lose marks if you do that wrong. So I show you a quick example. As you can see on here in like a slightly darker section, that is the prompt, and it will tell you roughly what the situation is about. So for example, in this case, you're trying to buy tickets at the ticket office, and it will tell you on here, for example, that you need to address the assistant using the former C. So it's really important that you have a look at the prompt and that you take this into account because they can mark you down if you're using the wrong address there. Then, as I mentioned, there's those two special tasks. When you see this exclamation mark in the actual tasks here, this means that you will have to respond to an unpredicted question that you will not find on your papers. So you need to listen really attentively and try to answer that one question right there on the spot. And the other special thing is this, where you see a question mark, and this means that you need to form a question based on the extra information that you are given. Okay, so I imagine that you will have already seen that kind of task before, but if you want to take some notes, you could go on here and click on a little button, and then this will allow you to keep some notes there, and this will save across all the different slides. So you don't need to worry about that, and you can always go back to your notes. Okay, so I've put on here some information. So in this case, for the first part, you would just have to think of any kind of relevant information that you might need to give someone if you want to buy tickets at a ticket office. That's quite important here. Then, as I said, you need to see if you can somehow prepare for the unforeseen question. Obviously, you will already have the context, so you can probably predict quite well what kind of extra questions an examiner might ask. And then it's always a good idea to reuse some of the words from the prompt in your answer, because then you don't need to come up with your own vocabulary. Then we've got question or part number 3. This is the one where you need to form a question yourself. So in this case, you need to ask a question when the next train is going to be, and then obviously the one thing that people tend to find most difficult is the word order when asking questions in German. So we will have a look at that a bit later on again. Then 4, this is a very common one where it just says Ihre Meinung über, and then obviously the last bit changes. In this case, it's your opinion about Salzburg, which is a town in Austria, but you will find the first bit, your opinion about, in very, very many roleplay tasks, so that's something you can prepare quite well for, and you could always use the same structure, so something like I find Salzburg amazing, something like this. What you also often find is when I give you some kind of details, so for example in this case you've lost something, and then they specify several different bits of details that you need to give. So in this case you need to answer what and where. That's the important bits there, but otherwise you're completely free what you want to include. So just think of any kind of objects, any names for objects that you can think of, and then obviously with where you're completely free as well. It could be anywhere at all. Doesn't really matter as long as you answer those 2 bits, and it's fairly logical, I guess. Right, so again, that's just the key things to keep in mind, that you should be aware of how to ask questions, because you will always have to do that. You need to try and adapt your language to the situation, so be careful to read the prompts, and then make sure that you also use the correct pronouns. And obviously sometimes you have a task where there will be more than one detail required, so you need to read the task very carefully and make sure that you really give all those required details. Otherwise, again, you could lose some marks. Okay. Right. So what the examiners actually like to see. I already mentioned this. It's really important that you read the scenario bit at the beginning of the task very carefully so that you know how to address the examiner, so either using du or sie. That just depends on how formal or informal the situation is. And then the good thing is, once you've understood the prompt and scenario, this will help you to work out what those tasks actually require you to do as well. The good thing is that you can ask the examiners indefinite times to repeat their questions. They can't rephrase it, but if it's a bit too quick and you think you've missed something, or you just want to get a bit more time, you can ask them in German, obviously, to repeat the questions, or you could, for example, ask me bitte. But you should really try to avoid using any English at all, because, as I said, it's about the clarity of communication. And then if you use some English words, and then they will just say that it wasn't clear at all, and so you will lose quite a few marks there. One kind of advice, as I said, because it's important to have really clear communication. In general, it's better to use short and simple answers for the roleplay task, so that you can really focus on correct grammar. You don't have any mistakes because you're trying to make some really complicated sentences or using some fancy vocabulary. That's something you can do in the picture card, but for this task generally it's better to have short answers, just because of the way it is marked and what the examiners focus on. So just remember, short and simple answers often get you further in that kind of task. Okay. I've had a look at all the previous role plays from previous years, and it tends to be quite similar vocabulary. Okay, so I've already mentioned a couple of those. There will very often be prompts that require you to give an opinion, so you might actually see the word Meinung for opinion there. They might ask you about advantages and disadvantages of some different aspects. Eigenschaften is something that they tend to put in there as well, so that would be traits or characteristics. Or they might just simply ask you whether you're for or against something. Okay, so that's some kind of vocab related to prompts that tends to come up quite often. I've put the translations on here if you're not sure, but hopefully by now you will already know those quite well. Obviously, the question words are really important, because as we've seen, those prompts that you get are quite short, that you don't get a full question, but often they will just say, oh, give some details about this, and then they will just include one or two of those question words, and then you need to work out what you're actually supposed to do. So it's really important that you know all of the main question tasks, otherwise you won't be able to respond correctly. You might still be able to give a correct sentence, but since it won't fit the actual prompt, you will lose quite a few marks there, which is a bit of a pity really. So again, just check that you know all of those ones, because they're the most common ones really. Quite often they will also include something with time in there. So you might have some questions referring to the future or the past. So it's important that you know those time markers and that you can obviously then decide which tense you need to use. So that's the most common ones. But it might be some different markers as well that show you whether you need to refer to the future or the past. There's a couple of role plays as well that are supposed to be transactional language, so you will have to buy something or order something. So I've put that kind of vocab on here as well, so that's the most common ones. Obviously those tasks are a bit tricky, just because you don't tend to see them too often in reading and listening papers, and then obviously that means that teachers don't always focus on that kind of language for a long time. But once you've done a couple of those, that vocab should kind of stick really. But if you're not sure, again, I've put those on here. And then lastly, there could be some further questions referring to your opinion, which are a little bit tricky, I guess. But they should help you to work out how to respond to those questions if you're not sure. So I've put 2 tasks on here just for you if you want to practice that key vocabulary. So you could either just pause the video for a second and attempt those tasks, or obviously if you have accessed this presentation, you can just do them right on here. So you could just click on those dots to find the correct translations. I'll just give you a second, obviously if you pause the video that might be helpful, and then we can check those together, okay? Right, so let's just have a look. Meinung obviously should be opinion. Vorteil is advantage. Then Eigenschaft, we've discussed this, that's trait. Zukunft, again, that is a pretty common word, that should be future. We've got denken, which is to think. Nachteil is a disadvantage. And then we've got earlier is früher, and the last bit, Karten, is tickets, okay? Then there's another one that you can do. That's not mainly not the exact question vocab that I've put on the previous slides, but they tend to still come up quite often. That's some recurring objects like a clock, for example. There's a couple of key objects that role plays tend to refer to. So you could have a go at this little hangman game and see if you know those keywords there. I'm not going to go through all of them because it would just take too long, but if you've got access to that presentation, you can have a go at those and see whether you know all of them. In the meantime, I just want to have a look at an example of a role play, so that you know how to respond to those, or how to approach them. I think it's a bit tricky sometimes to work out exactly what they want you to answer, because they don't formulate a question as such on the papers that you get. They will just use simple keywords, like in this example, your school subjects, and then they put wie viele, so how many. It's not a complete question that they give you, just some keywords. So some students find it a bit tricky to work out exactly what they are required to do. I guess in this example it's fairly clear, but there's some other tasks where it's not exactly that clear, so that can be quite challenging. But once you've worked out what you are actually required to do, the good thing is that you can respond to this in any way that you want. I've put some sentence starters on here. So for example, I have, or all in all I have, and then you would just have to add some details. So if you want, you can try that for a second and pause the video, but then I can show you a example of what that could actually look like. So the actual question that you will then get in the examination is wie viele Schulfächer hast du? So the examiner will then ask you actually a complete question, but unfortunately this is not actually included on your papers, which I think is a bit tricky, but that's just something you need to get accustomed to. And then you could give a short answer. It doesn't have to be any longer than that, just say I have, and then however many school subjects. Again, it's often better to have a short answer like this, just 4 words, rather than trying to form a really complicated advanced sentence, because that's when people tend to make mistakes, and that will lose you some marks. This one is, I guess, a little bit clearer. So you just need to give one opinion about your timetable. Sorry. And again, it's your choice how you want to answer that question. It is often better to just include one single opinion or one single word there. Again, just because it's important to avoid making any mistakes. But you're fairly free on how you want to answer this. So for example, you could say I find, and then just add an opinion word. You could use meiner Meinung nach, which I guess is a bit of a more advanced structure, because you need to be careful with the word order, but that works as well. Or you could just say my timetable is, and then again just add a simple word there. So you're absolutely free how you want to formulate the question, as long as you just make sure you've included an opinion there. The good thing is, because those kinds of tasks tend to be in pretty much every role play, you can just formulate them once and then reuse the same structure again and again and again, and just adapt the key details. So you could always say ich finde es, and then just say good or bad or anything like this. Okay, so one example on here. I find my timetable quite boring. it doesn't have to be any longer than that, can even be a little bit shorter still. Just make sure that your grammar is correct. Okay, question 3. Again, that's one of those really hieroglyphic tasks there, where they just give you one key aspect, in this case just your homework, and then they provide one question word there that's where you are required to give some specific information about that. So in this case you need to just say how often you get homework, and then again it's up to you to decide how you want to answer this question. I've just given you a couple of sentence starters that you might want to use if you want to try this task by yourself. And then here is an example. So for example, in my school we've got homework every day. It doesn't have to be correct either, because no one is going to be able to check it. Just think any kind of time phrase that comes to mind and where you're fairly certain that your vocab is correct. Okay, so we've got 2 more. There will always be exactly 5 tasks to do. Now the next one in this case is one of those unforeseen questions where you will just see an exclamation mark on your papers. So it's important to just prepare for that and know exactly when you will encounter that question. Just take your papers along with you, and then remember, oh, the 4th task is going to be this, or the 3rd task, whenever it's going to appear on your role play card, and then you can try and prepare for that as well. Now obviously in this case we've heard, for example, we had something about homework, we had something about timetable and subjects, so you can be pretty sure that the unforeseen question is going to be related to those aspects. So you could have a think about, oh, we've discussed homework and how often you do your homework, so what else could people possibly ask about that point? And that should give you a pretty good idea of what you have to answer. So in this case I just show you what the actual question was in that paper, and it was, where do you do your homework? And then again you can reuse that vocabulary in your own sentence. So for example, I do my homework in my room. So there's very little own vocabulary that you need to provide, just 2 or 3 words, and then the rest you can just adapt from the question, because I know it's quite difficult to respond spontaneously to something that you haven't been able to prepare for, so it's always a good idea to just pick up some of the vocab from that question. Quite often the question that you need to ask will be the very last thing to do, but that's not always the case. So with this one you just need to ask a question about English at your school. Now obviously that's a bit of a strange prompt there, but you can ask whatever question you want as long as it relates to English in some way. So I've just thought about a couple of things that you might ask, like do you learn English at your school? How do you like English? Do you have English at your school? Those kind of things. What you will hopefully see is that in this case we've always got the verb first and then the pronoun after. So that's important to remember. For questions we need to basically swap those around. That's something that people tend to get wrong quite often. So if you have a question, just remember verb first and then the personal pronoun after. Okay, so we've got findest du and magst du and so on. So just be aware of that, because if there's a lot of pressure and you need to respond quickly, people tend to forget that even if they already know that quite well. Right, so if you want to have a go at a task on your own, then you could have a go at this bit on here and see if you can answer this. Okay, so we've got one just giving a opinion about documentaries, and then it's important to include as well one detail of why you think that. So if you say I don't like documentaries, just give a reason why you don't like them as well. So it's really important to stick to all parts of the question, and then if they specify exactly how many details you need to give them, please stick to that as well, because otherwise you can lose quite a few marks. Then obviously we've got watching TV, so just give any kind of details about what you've seen. It could be whatever you want to do, which film it was, how you liked it, where you watched it, with whom you watched it, and so on. Then we've got the unforeseen question, where you need to respond, so you could have a go at trying to predict it. So just think something about what else could they ask me relating to films or movies, series, whatever. Then we've got an advantage of cinemas. Again, you're fairly free of what you want to give as an example. Just think of any kind of vocabulary that you can remember and where you're fairly sure that you can use the correct vocab and grammar. So it could be, I don't know, is it too expensive, it's too noisy, or something like this. And then you just need to ask any kind of question relating to films. So just see if you want to have a go at that. And then I have already put the unforeseen question on here, so you could see if you are prepared very for that, whether your prediction is right. And then also see if you can answer that on the spot. Okay, so the unforeseen question in this case was wie viel Fernsehen ist gut für Kinder, so how much TV is good for children. A bit of a strange question, to be honest, and I guess quite hard to prepare for, but I guess if you've thought about different things that they can ask, you might be able to reuse some of the bullet points you've just jotted down before, and then just adapt that slightly to the exact question. Okay, so last thing I just want to have a look at is some more tips and tricks that students tend to find quite helpful. Again, I've already mentioned that the important thing with role plays is not that you try to show off your language, but that you are absolutely sure that the vocab and grammar is correct, because it's only about communication and not about impressing the examiners with any fancy language. Okay, so for the role play, try to stick to shorter answers, and this will hopefully save you some time in the preparation as well, so that you can just quickly, for 3 or 4 minutes, jot down some ideas for the role play, and then spend the majority of the time you've got to actually think of some longer answers for the picture card where you need to give a bit more details. Okay. Again, I've already mentioned this. Very often the unforeseen question will relate directly to the tasks before or after. So for example, in this case we had something about to read, and then obviously we've got that in the unforeseen question as well. So you can be pretty sure that this will have something to do, because they don't tend to jump around and ask completely unrelated bits. Okay. Since you have quite a lot of time to complete the role play, and you only need to provide very short answers, it's probably a good idea to really take your time and make sure you've understood the questions correctly, and then if necessary ask the examiners to repeat the question, and then make sure that you give an exact and correct answer. Okay, so it's better to take your time, just think for 5 to 10 seconds and then give a completely correct answer, and just to stumble around and mutter something, because then the examiners will have to grade everything that you said. They won't just pick out the correct sentence that you kind of managed to do in the end. They always have to take into account the entire utterance, I guess. So it's better to just think very quietly for a couple of seconds and then give a very precise answer, rather than trying to just react immediately and end up making mistakes. Okay. So just have a go and see if you can find some previous role plays and do that a couple of times, because as I said, a lot of times they are very similar in structure, and the vocab tends to be recurring as well. So once you've done a couple of those, that will make it a lot easier for you once you actually get to your actual GCSE exams. Okay. If you've got any other questions, or you think there's anything unclear, or you want some extra tasks to